Thank you for joining us today for this open text webinar, Global e-Invoicing and Tax Compliance, Leading Trends Driving Multinational Adoption. This is the third webinar in the Compliance Clarity series, where we will feature the latest research findings from the Billentis report. The e-invoicing landscape is truly a whirlwind of change, and today, Marcus Loeb, owner and CEO of Billentis, a global expert in e-invoicing and tax compliance, will equip you with the knowledge and strategies to navigate leading trends driving multinational adoption. As a bonus, all attendees will receive a complimentary copy of the Billentis 2024 report, Watch the Tornado, sponsored by OpenText. This comprehensive report provides invaluable insights into the latest trends, the emerging technologies, and the regulatory changes shaping the future of e-invoicing and integrated digital trade. My name is Karen McNair, and I'll be your host for today's session. I have over 20 years of B2B marketing experience from strategy to execution across multiple disciplines within OpenText. Before we begin, I'd like to cover a few housekeeping items. You can expand your slide area or maximize it to full screen by clicking on the arrows in the top right-hand corner. And I would ask that you ask all your questions during the webinar by submitting them through the Ask a Question box. We'll have a live Q&A session at the end of the webinar. Please know we do capture all the questions, so if we run out of time, we'll answer your questions later via email. If your slides are behind, push F5 on your keyboard to refresh the page. A recording of the event will be available after the event concludes and can be accessed using the same audience link sent to you earlier. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker for today, Marcus Loeb, owner and CEO of Billentis. Marcus is a seasoned expert in electronic invoicing and integrated digital trade. With a focus on B2B and B2G markets, he's founded and led multiple e-invoicing service providers. He has actively shaped industry standards and government policies through his roles in European Commission working groups and influential associations like GINA, VER, and EFA. Marcus?
Yes, thanks a lot for your introduction, Karen. Welcome everybody to this webinar today. Happy to share some insights from the report that Karen just mentioned. Quickly about Billentis, as Karen mentioned as well, Billentis is a highly specialized consulting company for e-invoicing and tax compliance on a global basis, active since 1999, over 25 years of experience with over 200 different solution providers, governance, and companies choosing the right e-invoicing model for their businesses. And as she mentioned as well, this report will be available to you on the OpenText website and will be provided to you after that webinar. So before sharing some of the highlights of the report, just to let you know that you can use all of that information, the diagrams, text, etc., as long as you refer to Billentis as the source, you're free to do so. So actually, let's start with this webinar today. And probably all webinars today need to start with AI, and so do I as well today, which obviously is a very visible revolution in the business and private lives of all of us. With the changes that AI will cause, like in mobility, with learning, etc., that's a very visible change in our daily life. Even though the hype might have slowed down the last couple of months, it's still very visible. What we tend to forget or not to realize sometimes is that there is another revolution happening in parallel, which we call the silent revolution, and which is EI, meaning electronic invoicing. This change is mainly for the businesses, obviously, but the changes are as massive as with AI that we expect for the next couple of years. It will change the way companies work, interact with their peers, with their business partners, not only in terms of e-invoicing, but also with related aspects like payments, orders, etc. That's why we believe there will be massive changes ahead caused by AI. And that's also one of the reasons why we named that report Watch the Tornado. This is a diagram which is taken from a concept of Geoffrey Moore explaining about the life cycle of technologies. And the concept he introduced is the one of the tornado, saying that there's a specific time within the life cycle where everybody is looking for a solution, where it will be even challenging to find solution providers as the demand is growing massively. And this is obviously the tornado. And this is actually the phase of the life cycle where we believe e-invoicing is in right now. And with all the mandates for e-invoicing that we will talk about in a minute, this curve probably for e-invoicing will even be steeper compared to the one we just see. So we will certainly see those massive changes within the next few years only. But where are we today with e-invoicing? Just a snapshot, a diagram or a world map with the status of e-invoicing in 2024. This map shows the penetration of electronic invoicing in all different areas, B2G, B2B, and also including B2C, saying that there's a volume of invoices, but not only electronic, but including paper of 560 billion invoices that are exchanged on a global basis. Typically, it is like 50% in B2B and 50% in B2C. Nevertheless, if we look at the paperless share of invoices, it's still only about 16% on a global basis. And we divided countries into different stages, from leaders to average, developing to laggards. And if you look at the map, you can see that, for example, Latin America is pretty advanced when it comes to e-invoicing, because they introduced e-invoicing already like more than 15 years ago. Europe catching up, and lots of developments in Asia, and also the US starting to have more e-invoicing penetration. If we look at the different regions, you kind of see a similar development in terms of growth. In total, we speak about 125 billion electronic invoices that we see in 2024, and kind of a similar growth between B2B and B2C. You can recognize a little difference when it comes to APAC, Asia Pacific, where you have a hyper growth in different areas, specifically caused by B2C, because B2C invoices are heavily moved to electronic processes with the point of sale and different changes that occur in the next couple of years and already occurred just recently. So what is driving actually all of this change and this development? And talking about the major trends and drivers for e-invoicing, we certainly need to talk about tax authorities and what we call the VAT gap. And this is the main reason why tax authorities in many countries started to implement and introduce new tax requirements that allow and even make it mandatory to provide information to the tax authority to avoid the VAT gap, to increase the VAT revenue in a certain country. And I apologize, it's a pretty busy slide, but it tries to explain the different models and categorize the different models that are used on a global basis to cover those tax reporting requirements, which is different to e-invoicing. So just very high level explaining those different models to make you understand those changes. In the past, models were mainly focusing on purely reporting, the obligation for companies to send invoice information, but not the invoice as such, to the tax authorities, which is the real-time reporting, for example. The invoicing process is completely separate. When it comes to clearance, another solution that is mainly used in Latin America, for example, you had to, or still have to, send an invoice to the tax authority before and ask for approval before you can finally provide it to your customer. So still the tax reporting process and the e-invoicing is separate. Now, what we see starting not only in Europe, but also Asia mainly, is the setup of new models where also the e-invoicing process is regulated. For example, with a centralized exchange, where all invoices need to be transferred to a central platform, which will then forward and process the invoice for the receiver. So all invoices are managed by a single platform, which has specific challenges, obviously. A very prominent example of that model is Italy, where all that information needs to be processed via the central platform. What we currently see emerging in many countries, and then we have examples in France, but also in Singapore, the Emirates, with a new model called decentralized CTC and exchange, or just five corner, which is a model that allows businesses to only have one single interface to their preferred service provider. And the service provider will then manage both processes to provide the invoice to the buyer via another service provider, and at the same time provide the relevant information to the tax authorities for the tax reporting. And that's why this model covers both the requirements for tax reporting, but at the same time allows for business automation as the service providers make sure all information is managed that is needed by both senders and receivers, suppliers and buyers, to finally automate their processes. And that's why also interoperability between service providers is crucial for those models. And that's why Gina and Pepol are mentioned on that slide, because they started to create global standards that are used between service providers to cover interoperability amongst the different peers. And mainly those new models come together with B2B mandates for electronic invoicing. And this is just a rough overview now, again, to show you the development and to visualize what is happening currently with already existing B2B requirements, where all invoices in B2B need to be managed and transferred electronically. So Latin America, as I told you, is already pretty advanced. Still, there are another 5 countries coming up soon with those B2B requirements, covering the whole southern part of the Americas and Central America. Europe, where we currently just have 4 countries with B2B mandates, but there is a recent development with an initiative called VAT in the Digital Age, VIDA, which probably will require all countries to set up those kind of solutions until 2030. So that's why already another 10 countries announced that they will establish similar solutions and requirements. And as I mentioned just a few minutes ago, APAC, Asia Pacific, is a very dynamic area in that respect. Main countries like India already introduced those mandates, with China to follow soon, and many Southeast Asian countries already established it as well. Most of them based on this 5-column model that I just mentioned. So you can see the world is moving very dynamically. Just within the next few years, 2, 3, 4 years, all of these requirements will be established and change the world completely for all companies, because they need to cope with all these upcoming requirements pretty soon. And all of this will obviously lead to a massive growth of electronic invoicing for the next couple of years. With this chart looking at the time until 2028 only, but already sees a growth and then doubling of the figures for electronic invoicing from roughly 90 billion to 184. But just keep in mind that this diagram includes all of the B2C areas as well, where we see growth just happening probably after 28, with a focus on B2B and B2G first. That's why if you look at specific regions and maybe even countries, that growth can obviously be much higher. For example, even B2B mandatory requirement is introduced, obviously this will grow to almost 100% until the requirement is in place. But besides the pure VAT gap and the new tax requirements, there are some additional trends that I would just quickly touch upon. One of those being ESG, which is probably mainly known because of the environmental aspect and the CO2 footprint that paper invoices have. So what we tried as part of the report is also to do a calculation of this footprint for one invoice, which you can see is divided into footprint from absorption, but also production, with 120 grams of CO2 for one single invoice. And if you would do the calculation for all existing invoices, 560 billion, you end up with 67 million tons of CO2, quite substantial change for CO2. But obviously, it's not only about environmental aspects, it's also about social ones, because, for example, there is a financial benefit from early payments if you introduce electronic invoicing with typically 5 to 7 days earlier payments, but even society benefit from increased tax revenue by closing the VAT gap that I mentioned earlier. One interesting aspect is also with governance. This is for Europe only currently, but as you might know, some companies, well, about 50,000 companies already need to report about CO2 footprint and scope, what is called scope 3 emissions already during this year. And the discussion that we have with the European Commission is that the information about the CO2 footprint of a specific product and of a company as such is included into the European standard for e-invoicing, which then would allow companies to extract that information from the invoices and to make it much easier to create those reports. Especially interesting if for the next couple of years, all companies need to create those reports in Europe, and also Asia is thinking about similar trends. Well, coming back to AI, obviously, with yet other massive changes that we see happening, even though not everything can be solved by AI already. So for example, if you look at that picture on your left, one of those guys should be myself. I don't know how you feel. I can't recognize myself with this. And even tornado is not spelled the correct way by AI yet. But this is changing like every single week currently. And we already see a lot of applications that have been influenced by by artificial intelligence, sorry. Mainly when it is about automated data capture, for example, when, for example, invoice data needs to be extracted from PDF invoices to create structured invoices like XML files, UBL files that are required now in most of those countries. This is happening with AI already today to a large extent and with success rates of almost 100% with the extraction of data. It also supports a lot already when it comes to fraud detection. This means the AI is able to detect duplicate invoices, for example, irregular transactions, and different other suspicious activities. It also becomes much more interesting if you look at predictive analytics with the opportunity for early payments that can be detected by AI already. In the future, that might be extended to different additional aspects. For example, looking at smart contracts, where you could imagine a combination with blockchain technology, where all the process of ordering, invoicing, payment will be managed by blockchain models. And something that will come up very soon, not to mention all of these aspects, is, for example, dispute resolution, where the communication with suppliers, customers is handled automatically already by AI. Now, another important aspect and trend that we currently see happening is what we call integrated digital trade. So it's no longer about e-invoicing only. Many companies already started not only to be compliant and to stay compliant, but to cover this whole process of integrated digital trade, including payments, orders, financing, tax determination, etc. So use it as an opportunity to look at their own processes and to do business automation as much as possible. But if we look at the companies and how they deal with those upcoming requirements, we see a difference between SMEs and large enterprises, where SMEs focus rather on what we call embedded finance, including payment information, financing, but large enterprises rather focus on supply chain automation just because of the large volumes that they need to manage with orders, invoices, the whole procurement process. And that's why many of those already started to look at those processes before they finally end up with integrated digital trade and also add payment and financing process. Now, talking about those multinational businesses, we see quite a lot of challenges for those because they need to act in a very challenging environment with different requirements in all these countries. There's almost no single requirement looking the same compared to another country. They have different systems in place, and that's why they need to become more proactive to manage those requirements compared to the past, where they just followed specific developments in a country and ended up with quite a mess of different solutions and process silos that were allowed in different countries. So the development that we see is that where today those companies used to have up to 20 different service providers, for example, for inbound processes, sometimes even up to 160 service providers for outbound, that this will be reduced heavily to just maybe one or two service providers that are able to manage that process on a multinational basis. And the typical scenario for that implementation for many is that they first try to centralize the whole process before they then replace the paper invoices with electronic invoices. And once this is done, then look into the automation of all relevant processes, what we just call the integrated digital trade. Another strategy is because currently the focus is often on the outbound process, but never forget one, the intercompany billing, which is a process creating a lot of invoices as well, and where you have all the influence to do the changes, but also the inbound process with your suppliers, where you have high savings because of the complex process, but on the other hand, the purchasing power to motivate your suppliers to implement those changes also on their side. And that's why we end with this slide where we show different processes and approaches to manage your suppliers in order to get to 100% automation. The recommendation here really is to go for what we call the loop e-order process, also kind of an integrated digital trade approach, where you don't only look at the invoices, but include the orders specifically to have the highest possible conversion and the fastest move and rollout to electronic invoices as a whole. So this was just in a nutshell the challenging trends that we see for the next couple of years, with a lot of opportunities for companies to change their processes and to benefit from those changes in the near future. And that's why I actually want to end with one single recommendation, which is just start e-invoicing now. So thanks for listening, and back to Karen.
Thank you, Marcus. I see we've got some great questions that have come in, so let's jump into it.